I come out of the intelligence community where our job was to provide policymakers, quote unquote, decision advantage and early warning. And the only way you're going to do that well in today's world is if you bring a climate lens to what you're doing. If you have good climate data, if you have a good understanding of what to expect in terms of extreme weather, because otherwise you're going to miss things or get things wrong.
In this ClimateGenn episode, I'm speaking with Erin Sikorsky, Director at the Centre for Climate and Security, and also the Security Director at the International Military Council on Climate and Security. We're discussing issues that Erin covers in her new book, Climate Change on the Battlefield. Erin guides us in untangling the contradictions of investing in modern warfare, while simultaneously struggling to keep citizens safe from the extreme impacts of fire and floods that are worsening in intensity and in frequency. In Spain in recent days, there's been 199 wildfires counted, with more across the northern hemisphere, whilst floods across countries like Pakistan and China and across South America and beyond are taking lives and costing billions in infrastructure damage. Yet countries are being coerced into spending hundreds of billions on defence that excludes protecting against the raging climate. How we proceed from here has consequences, and Erin, with her book, Climate Change on the Battlefield, offers many essential insights. In the next episode, I speak with world-famous ecologist and founder of the ecosystem restoration communities, John D. Liu. It's an in-depth interview with John, daring to reimagine a future that we might just want to strive for. An additional segment of the interview with John is in the members area, where he discusses how China has managed transformational change over the last 70 years or so. There are many more interviews being recorded, so please do stay tuned, subscribe, share, become a member, and please do comment. I try hard to read all responses and comments and appreciate the insights. Thank you for supporting the ClimateGenn project. So Erin, thank you very much for taking the time to speak to me. It's great to see you. As we speak, there are literally wars raging around the world, and we see this huge drive in defense spending across many nations. Europe is a great focus. At the same time, we see great swathes of the northern hemisphere on fire. Can you talk to us a little bit about the complexity of how extreme climate impacts are becoming interwoven with military objectives, with budgets, and the overall effectiveness of military planning?
Sure. Thanks so much for having me, Nick. As you said, countries don't have the luxury of only focusing on one threat at a time right now, right? You have traditional wars going on in Ukraine and across sub-Saharan Africa and the Middle East, but you also have these extreme weather events. I was just reading yesterday about France and the unprecedented wildfires they're seeing there. And so militaries are involved in both. They're involved in these hot conflicts, and Europe especially is very keen to prepare in case Russia's continued aggression spreads outside of Ukraine. They realize they need to modernize and update their militaries, but they're also deploying militaries to fight these wildfires. And so governments are trying to think through, how do we build resilience to multiple threats, and how might these threats layer on top of and exacerbate one another. One example I can give you is Russia frequently takes advantage of extreme weather events that happen in Western Europe. With last year in Poland, there was extreme precipitation and flooding, and the military there deployed in huge numbers. Something like 20,000 Polish soldiers were out helping with the response. Well, Russia at the same time launched a social media disinformation campaign blaming the Polish government for the floods, encouraging the local population to protest and complain about the government. And so they tried to create internal instability in the wake of this event. So, sometimes you see a false choice between either we prepare for extreme weather or we prepare for traditional conflict in militaries. But I think the only way that countries will really be safe in this future world is if they can figure out how to do both. And certainly there are investments you can make in your budget that can help you do both. But it requires a commitment and smart thinking about how to approach that.
You just mentioned these disinformation campaigns. This is this sort of hybrid war. How effective are governments dealing with that? I mean, that seems to sort of come in from a left field, but these are real issues.
It's a huge challenge. And I think, I was at the NATO summit in The Hague in June, and I was struck in listening to defense ministers at the public forum talking all about hybrid warfare threats, talking about that being the number one threat facing Europe. But then at the same time, or in the next breath, talking about the importance of investing in military equipment like tanks and airplanes and things like that. And I think there's a little bit of a disconnect, right? When we're talking about hybrid warfare being the main threat, which is things like disinformation going against critical infrastructure, cyber attacks, and then this more traditional warfare concept. Not to say that countries in Europe don't need fighter jets and tactical vehicles for the battlefield. I mean, we've seen in Ukraine the value of those, but at the same time, you can't forget about the other investments to manage hybrid warfare. And I think that's where investments in resilience and adaptation to climate threats can really help, because you build resilience in your infrastructure, you build resilience in your electrical grid, right? You diversify your energy sources. That all helps in the hybrid warfare front. And I think countries recognize this. Europe's got a great hybrid warfare center of excellence based in Finland that NATO uses, and they've really become more sophisticated in responding and pushing back against disinformation. But I think there's still more to do, clearly.
Okay, and you just mentioned this sort of disconnect. On the one hand, you're talking about infrastructure and first responder challenges, and then on the flip side, you're talking about fighter jets and tanks. How intrinsically prepared are the army or military forces, navy or whatever for these kinds of vast wildfires you might see in Canada or Spain or France, for example?
And I think the challenge that militaries are facing is they're pretty reactive to these moments, right? They are not, by and large, proactively planning for them, because they see that these duties, fighting wildfires, responding to flooding, as kind of extra on top of their real job, which is going to fight and win wars, which is fair to a certain extent, except that they're really only, in many countries, the only institution with the capacity and the logistics capabilities to really move out quickly and deploy to protect communities and to protect countries. So, often you see, I think, militaries somewhat on the back foot in response, and a lot of complaints. You've seen this in Canada, you've seen it in Australia, where military leaders say, like, this shouldn't be our job, we don't want to do this, but yet the governments don't have other alternatives, so they keep turning back to militaries. One thing I was just reading yesterday, the US Senate, in its annual defense authorization bill, actually tackled this very issue regarding wildfires in the US and includes a bunch of provisions in the bill with bipartisan support for the Army to better prepare and strategize around fighting wildfires, to make sure it has the right equipment, that soldiers have the right training, that they understand how they might be used in these circumstances. And I think that's really important. And I think I'd like to see more of that from other militaries.
Interesting, especially coming from the US at a sort
Yeah.
of time like now. One thing I was interested in your book, I mean, you talk about so many different aspects, but was also the threat to the military itself, its own
hmm
bases, its own infrastructure, its own equipment. Can you just sort of give an example of how climate impacts can interfere with infrastructure, all those things?
Absolutely. I mean, there's many examples here in the United States where extreme weather events have forced the evacuation of bases, have interrupted training missions. One of the marquee examples that's referred to frequently is Hurricane Michael, which hit Tyndall Air Force Base on the Gulf Coast of Florida a few years ago, causing billions of dollars of damage, destroying some of the most expensive and exquisite airplanes the US military operates, and requiring a lot of training missions to move elsewhere outside of the base as it got rebuilt. It is just now, really in the past year, 5 years after the hurricane, reopening, coming back online, rebuilding at a huge cost. And so that example gets repeated over and over again, both in the United States, but also in the Pacific Islands, where the US has military bases. And also at smaller scales, too. I've talked to officials in the US military about bases in California where extreme precipitation might flood a certain road in a very large military base. So it doesn't destroy the base, but it interrupts your ability to get from point A to point B at that base, meaning that your training missions take longer. Your troops are annoyed because they spend a lot more time in the car in this big desert base, right? So it undermines readiness, both at the kind of big level with the big marquee events, but also on an everyday level. One other thing I'll say about that I think there hasn't been quite enough attention to is it's not just about the infrastructure and equipment, it's also about the people who serve in the military. And when I was researching Tyndall for the book, what I found were reports of separations from service in the Air Force of airmen because after the flood and the hurricane, they got moved to a different base. They had to move their whole families. They weren't told how long they would be away. They were told different information at how permanent the move would be. And they got pretty frustrated and couldn't keep their families and community kids in school, and they decided to leave the military. So as we think about the impact these extreme weather events have, it's not just about the planes and the hangars, but it's also about the people.
We call this in the book as well. You take the sort of the communities, because the soldiers have families and their schools and so on and so forth, and they might be relocated. The costs were absolutely enormous from just, I think, two hurricanes. There were just billions and billions. Is there a threshold for these kinds of costs? Because how do you maintain effectiveness, keep spending all this money, and yet we know that more's on the way? And how do you keep the costs down? How do you plan through that?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. And I think there's a couple elements of it, right? There's the adaptation piece and making sure that your infrastructure, your bases are resilient to future climate hazards, which means you need to have information and data and analysis about what those future climate hazards will be and that you're planning to those specs, if you will. And this is something you see not just in the military, but across communities where you've got outdated flood plans, where you've got outdated building codes that were based on information from 20 years ago, as opposed to what things are going to look like in the future. So that's a piece of it. And, it's really interesting, even in this current Trump administration, where climate change is a word that is not allowed in documents. And there's been a real attack on climate science. The Defense Department continues and has put out policy guidance to this effect that extreme weather events, is what they call it, are something that the military still needs to be prepared for and addressing in its infrastructure. So they recognize the military is very pragmatic, right? They recognize the costs. Members of Congress recognize the costs. They don't like spending that money. And so making those investments is important. I will say, though, because the Trump administration is attacking so much climate science, it makes it really hard for the Defense Department to make smart decisions about infrastructure resilience if they don't have good data and information from, say, NOAA or NASA. But the challenge is adaptation will only get you so far. I mean, as you know, with climate change, we also have to cut emissions and mitigate and bend that curve down so temperatures don't keep going up. So in the long run, for military bases to have resilience, for the military to be able to operate, we also need to find ways to cut emissions so that temperatures don't rise as much as they're currently projected to, because at a certain level, right, there's no adaptation that's possible. So you got to be able to do both, right?
There's a new term that I discovered in the last day or so, which is defense washing.
Interesting.
In relation to mainly the sort of US pressure on Europe to spend more on defense, and Spain
Mm,
saying, hey, we've got some real problems here. Can we include what we're using our special, our army forces, our military forces for the first responders to these fires and things, and being laughed at and being sort of scoffed at. And you covered this in your Substack letter. And I just want to, it seems to be exactly what you're talking about, is that where's this line between what is planning for defense, as in military defense, and what is planning for in climate defense,
hmm.
which equally you could say are threats to citizens.
Absolutely. And, I mean, this has been a big debate with with NATO this year and the commitment that NATO has made to increase defense spending to 5% of GDP for all its countries by 2030, I believe. Within that 5%, 3.5 is supposed to be quote unquote real military spending, and 1.5 can be for societal resilience, things like bridges and roads. And in some cases, countries are arguing it should be for climate adaptation and resilience. I think that's very important. I actually think the percentages perhaps should be switched, because at the end of the day, if you don't have resilient communities, right, you aren't resilient to military threats. If you don't have the ability in the Danube or the other rivers of Europe, which have been running dry this summer due to heat waves, right? If you don't have the ability to move military equipment along those rivers, you're going to be at risk. So it's not, again, back to our earlier conversation, it's not either or. It should be both, but it's been challenging. I think, what I've heard some folks say in Europe is that Spain's just saying out loud what other countries are thinking behind the scenes. And you see right now, I mean, Spain's got its military deployed fighting the wildfires there, that they've had to evacuate thousands of people. It's a real challenge. And I think this will only become more acute as time goes on, and it'll be interesting to see how countries, when the time comes to explain what they've spent that 5% on, what it really includes. At the same time, too, I mean, even just the buying of the military equipment, that's another place where you want to think about, where will that military equipment be deployed in the future? How hot will it be? Is this equipment resilient to heat stress? What kind of energy does it use? Does it use fossil fuel energy that you need to get from natural gas pipelines from Russia or shipped over from the United States? And that both of those countries, frankly, are much more unreliable than ever before. Or are you using, is it hybrid? Are you able to leverage clean energy for those vehicles and then give yourself a little more flexibility on the battlefield? So that's another place where I think the climate and environment considerations should come in as European countries are thinking about military spending.
Yeah, you use a very good example in the book about, I was shaking my head because it was a British example about the using the Land Rovers in Afghanistan, and
Yeah.
they,
Yeah.
they were very sensitive to IEDs, these sort of explosive devices, and then they switched them out for these these other ones which weren't heat protected. So they, in extreme
Yeah.
heat, they just stopped. It does seem in a previous interview there was someone warning that if we're not careful, we could be spending all of our GDP on relocating citizens and cities and infrastructure and all. And it sounds like it's kind of started. And as the military has fallen into this role of, first responders, that we're kind of trying to figure out where to put it on the balance sheet in terms of the cost. And it's probably something that is going to rage on for quite a while. Do you think that, I think you do reference this as well in the book, is that this idea of when we're analyzing all the different various scenarios between nations, every country has its challenges. Climate change, I think there's a quote that climate change ceases to be this sort of individual issue, is that it's a sort of background component of every
Mm-hmm.
scenario. Do you think this is adequately seen in this way right now when we're reading about future outcomes, maybe threats from China or US clash or Russia or whatever?
No, I don't think it's adequately integrated, or what we would call mainstreamed, right, across understandings of different countries and threats. Again, it's very typical in the national security community to kind of rack and stack threats, right? What are my top 10 threats that I'm facing? And so is China a bigger threat than climate change, right? Terrorism a bigger threat than climate change? When really, as you're alluding to, the question is, how does climate shape competition with China? How does it shape Chinese national interests? We see China being more assertive in the Arctic region, for example. If climate change didn't exist, if the ice wasn't melting up there, China probably wouldn't be particularly interested in that region. So you have to understand those two things together. Similarly, I mean, in the past couple of weeks, Beijing has flooded. They've had to move thousands of people out of the city. When we're analyzing, as a former intelligence analyst, so if you're analyzing future stability in China and how well the government is managing to keep its thumb on the population, understanding how communities are reacting to these extreme weather events, how well the government is managing those. Those are all really important questions that, again, if you're not bringing a climate lens in, you might miss or get things wrong. And so I think it's really important that across governments, you don't just keep climate off in its own office by itself, siloed apart from other things, the real threats of China and Russia, for example, or Iran, but instead bringing those two things together. Unfortunately, I think in the US, we're probably further away from doing that than we were just a couple of years ago. But that said, countries around the world have released climate security action plans for their militaries and security services over the past 5, 6 years. There's a lot of countries thinking about this. I think on the whole, progress is being made, but there's a lot more that can be done.
I just want to concentrate on one topic that I've interviewed quite a few researchers on this collapsing AMOC scenario, and you do mention
Mm.
it in the book. When we talk about it, we talk it from a very scientific perspective in terms of what's actually going on. And then we quickly jump and we say, well, the outcome is going to be chaos. It's going to be a massive food security problem. Are you able to pick that apart, that chaos? How might a military respond to this sort of let's say there's a collapse of food supply chains in these sort of worsening scenarios? How might the military then be involved?
It's a really good question, and I'm glad to see there are more conversations about these bigger tipping points amongst a broader community more and more. I mean, I think there's a couple really interesting things about the AMOC. I mean, one is, and again, I'm not a scientist, but my understanding, right, is that its impact is geographically scoped. So a country like China would not be affected by it in the same way that Europe and the United States would. So I think right there you see in the geopolitical environment we're operating in, where you've got the West in chaos and at high risk of food security crisis, and you might have China sitting pretty. So that is one dynamic that I think militaries and security institutions should be thinking about and understanding and planning for. And then, more immediately in a major food security crisis like that, and you see previews of this in certain parts of the world already, but I think you see a lot more activity from the military in terms of the humanitarian response piece, distributing food, maybe even in the growing of food or managing of agricultural resources as more of a high security need. I mean, that's not something we've seen in the United States or Europe for a long time, right? But there are parts of the world. I mean, you look at Indonesia and Pakistan right now as they've faced flooding and extreme weather. Both countries have deployed their militaries to conduct agricultural planting and work and manage it because they see it as such a high priority and such a challenge in an extreme weather world. And so there would be a lot happening in that AMOC scenario, but it is the kind of what we would have called, I think, maybe 10, 15 years ago, a low probability, high impact scenario. Maybe now we're edging toward a high probability, high impact scenario. And that's the kind of thing that security actors need to prepare for and need to understand and build scenarios around in the same way that the US military war games out what a war over Taiwan would look like with China. They don't necessarily expect that to happen soon. They don't want it to happen soon, but they want to be prepared in case it does happen. I think similarly, they should be gaming out what does it mean for a tipping point like the AMOC. And so that means bringing in different people to talk to, building strong relationships with climate scientists, being able to engage in across different sectors to talk about these issues, to get the right answers and to be prepared.
Leading on from that a bit, with a hotter Atlantic, we have this sort of retreating Arctic sea ice and this emerging theatre, if you like, for
Mhm.
increased geopolitical activity. And we have this Atlantification of the Arctic, where a lot of the fisheries are moving north. And you talk about this in the book as well, in marine ecosystems. In this scenario, Arctic dominance translates into sort of very real, tangible benefits, it seems. How does this play out from a sort of military point of view for nations like any of Canada, Denmark, Norway, US, Russia?
There's a lot going on in the Arctic and a lot of different aspects of the security challenge there. I think one, at a very basic level, a warmer Arctic is a busier Arctic. So you have more countries with more activity there, both military and commercial activity. And a busier Arctic is a more dangerous Arctic because it's not turning into the Caribbean Sea, right? It's still a very dangerous and challenging place to operate. And so I think especially with commercial activity, commercial actors that are not prepared, the risk of accident, the risk of misperception, of activities, because we know both Russia and China use commercial activity as cover. And then you don't have a lot of good venues for having frank conversations anymore either. The Arctic Council, because of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, it's been challenged in its ability to engage with Russia. But the Arctic Council was never supposed to be the place where security conversations happened anyway. They explicitly kept security out of it to preserve a place for collaboration. But I think given the increased security activity in the region, there needs to be some venues for deconfliction, for talking amongst the key players up there to move that forward. I think certainly in the near term, Russia sees advantages to a melting Arctic because they have the largest Arctic territory of any country. They have the most capacity and the kind of sea route that you would go through some of their territorial waters for now. But that doesn't mean a melting Arctic is all upside for Russia either. They see it also as a threat. The ice has been a very nice natural deterrent and barrier for decades for them as that melts. They could feel more vulnerable also and feel the need to further militarize the region to defend themselves. Also in their Arctic territories, permafrost melt has destroyed a lot of infrastructure, including military airfields there. They've got a lot of wildfires they have to deal with, zombie fires in the Arctic that never stop burning, right, under the ice. So it's a really risky environment. And I think maybe one of the silver linings is that at some level, all countries face risks there. And so collaborating to manage those risks together, there may be some shared interests and opportunities to manage, especially if commercial interests are what is really driving, say, China's activity there. Stability, security is important for commercial activity to thrive. And there may be some ways to manage the more challenging security aspects because it's in everyone's interest to do so.
We see, China has declared itself, I can't remember if it's exactly as a near Arctic or interested part or
Yeah.
something. And the Trump administration has made a play for Greenland, which is causing a lot of discussion around
Hmm.
this sort of hard power politics of all of this. Is this what we have to look forward to in terms of hard power dictating how these emerging areas are going to shape? Or is there still a good chance that a sort of a reborn NATO, a stronger Europe, or a more collaborative force could actually resurface again and actually be a better way to tackle this?
I mean, look, I think the future is not preordained, right? I think the hard power kind of competition, zero sum approach is one path. And I think, unfortunately, under the current Trump administration, that's more likely than it was a few years ago. But at the same time, you see NATO and European countries kind of coming together more in reaction to that and doubling down on their collaboration and cooperation. I think the fact that Finland and Sweden have joined NATO, so you have two more Arctic nations there. I think there's an opportunity through that to manage more cooperatively in the Arctic as well, but it's risky. And I think the West can't control what Russia does. Europe can't control what the United States does, but they control what they do, right? And they can think carefully about military exercises in the Arctic and how to manage those. I mean, I do worry sometimes when we talk about the kind of geopolitical or hard power risks in the Arctic, we almost risk creating a self-fulfilling prophecy, right? If we're constantly up there exercising and sending military ships, and we just, like I said, increase the risk of accident and things spiraling out of control with escalation dynamics we don't fully understand. But that's not inevitable. And my understanding with Norway leading the Arctic Council last year, they were able to make some overtures to Russia and continue some collaboration and discussion, which I think is important. So I think there are some shared interests among multiple countries up there that could be used as opportunities to move things towards a more peaceful approach.
Just to end on, really, I wanted to just ask, when you're in your various roles and you're talking to people and offering advice, what's the sort of the main thing that you're saying, no, you need to be looking at this? What's the this that you're advising everyone to be focusing on?
This that I'm advising everyone to be focused on, I think, is, something I mentioned earlier is making sure that when you're making decisions, right? Because I come out of the intelligence community where our job was to provide policymakers, quote unquote, decision advantage and early warning. And the only way you're going to do that well in today's world is if you bring a climate lens to what you're doing, right? If you have good climate data, you have a good understanding of what to expect in terms of extreme weather, because otherwise you're going to miss things or get things wrong. So countries and governments that do that, militaries that do that, will be better prepared for the threats we face. And it's just a pragmatic approach to the world as it is.
Well, look, thank you very much. And I really enjoyed the book. So I do advise people to get it and start considering these issues. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Nick. I appreciate it.
If you are concerned about the future, then why not travel with me through every COP conference from COP21 in Paris to COP28 in Dubai by ordering my book COP Out: How Governments Have Failed the People on Climate. In COP Out you'll gain insights into what is actually going on in these supposed world-saving conferences and how we have ended up in this dire era of dangerous consequences. You can order COP Out via the link in the notes or on any online bookstore worldwide, in paperback or audio version.